Good afternoon, everybody, and on behalf of Director John Adler and the staff at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, let me welcome you to the Strategies for Policing Innovation, SPI, webinar on successful strategies to reduce gun violence. My name is Christopher Sun, and I am a research analyst with CNA's Institute for Public Research, program manager for BJA's SPI initiative, and I will be providing some brief opening remarks for today's webinar. Today we're focusing on an issue that's on the minds of many in this country, gun violence. Understanding that gun violence affects American communities in stark and devastating ways, a number of our SPI sites have directly addressed gun violence problems. Today we will hear from two of our SPI subject matter experts on gun violence, as well as three SPI sites that have important information to share about their respective approaches to understanding and addressing gun violence in their communities. Hildy Saizow and Dr. Scott Decker will be providing some brief introductory remarks on gun violence and gun violence research, as well as providing some background and context on approaches to reducing gun violence. These presentations will be followed by presentations from three of our SPI sites, including Deputy Chief Dennis Kato from Los Angeles Police Department, Bureau of Technical Assistance Services Chief Jonathan Lewin from Chicago Police Department, and Captain Richard Trudell from the Syracuse Police Department. Following these presentations, we do hope that you will provide some questions and good discussion to better understand your perspectives on this issue. We're especially thankful for the support of BJA in the SPI initiative and with investments in the Innovation Suite approach to justice system improvement. BJA provides a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies implementing and researching new strategies and tactics in a wide variety of law enforcement topics. So with that, I just have a couple of minor logistical items and requests of audience members. As Emma mentioned, please be sure to keep your phone muted while not speaking. It'll help reduce background noise for the recording and be respectful of the presenters. In addition, I'd like to thank Charles Stevenson, Zoe Thorkelson, and Emma Wohl here at CNA. They've been instrumental in putting together this particular webinar, both at the planning and execution stages. So we obviously appreciate all the help that they've provided. So with that, I will turn it over to Hildy to get us started and facilitate this webinar. Hildy?
Thank you, Chris. Let me just remind people that if you have questions as we move along in this webinar, please use your chat function to submit those questions. And at the end, we're going to address many of your questions. So please keep that in mind. So today's topic is, as Chris said, and unfortunately very timely considering the recent school shooting in Florida. There couldn't be a more appropriate issue to discuss at this time than strategies to reduce gun violence. Now, my job today is to set the context for this discussion, and I'll do so by presenting some long-term and short-term trends in gun violence and their implications for strategy development. So let's start with what's at the top of mind at this moment, mass shootings. Since 1982, there have been 95 mass shootings in the U.S. And as you can see from the slide, the number has increased substantially just in the last decade. Half, or even 48 of these shootings occurred just since 2009. And the number of casualties is fairly staggering. 776 deaths and close to 2,000 people with injuries. But these numbers are small compared to the number of homicides nationwide, although there's been some good news in this area. In the last 25 years, according to the UCR, the number of homicides has fallen by 27%. While 24,000 homicides occurred in 1992, this number dropped to about 17,000 by 2016. However, the bad news is that there's been an uptick in homicides in the last 2 to 3 years, and the percentage of homicides committed by gun has increased too, from 68% of all homicides in the beginning of the 25-year period to 73% by the end. But even these numbers are measured compared to the number of non-fatal gunshot injuries that occur nationwide. The UCR doesn't track non-fatal, so we turn to the CDC's injury statistics, called Whiskers, which provides national estimates. Now, the trend in assault-related gunshot injuries is really something quite different from homicide. In fact, just the opposite. Since 2001, there's been a 52% increase in gunshot injuries. So the reality is that a much smaller portion of shootings result in fatalities, many more non-fatal, often because of timely responses by emergency services or simply the result of a poor shooter. Now, research indicates these non-fatal shooting victims are at high risk for future involvement in gun violence, very high risk. In other words, non-fatal shooting victims and even their perpetrators may become tomorrow's victims of gun violence. Now, another important trend concerns the role of geography. Here, I turn to a study by Dr. Richard Rosenfeld, who analyzed the recent rise in homicides nationwide. So while murders increased recently, 11% in 2015 and 8% the following year, most of this increase occurred in the nation's big cities, but not in all big cities. So you can see on the slide variation in homicide changes across 46 big cities. Now, the first 27 listed here have vertical bars to the right, indicating they had very large homicide increases. For example, 4 cities exceeded a 50% increase, and 12 cities exceeded 25%. On the other hand, 19 cities listed nearer the bottom had either flat or declining homicides. Now, the final trend I wanted to mention concerns an indicator of police activity related to gun violence, and that's the clearance rate. Now, this is the proportion of crimes that result in an arrest of a suspect. Again, you can see on the slide tremendous variation in the big city clearance rate for both homicides and for gun assault. Now, while the homicide clearance hovered around 60%, close to the national average, the gun assault clearance rate was much, much lower, around 30%. The point here is that much less attention is given to gun assault, when these incidents could have a bearing on whether the next shooting is actually prevented or not. So, what are the implications of this data for strategy development at the local level? Well, I think it gives us a few key nuggets. First, the good news that we experienced fewer homicides than 25 years ago still holds true. But other indicators of gun violence tell a different story. This suggests we need multiple indicators about the problem, and not just law enforcement data. In addition, we should factor in how closely related homicides and non-fatal shootings are, and consider both when analyzing the problem and developing solutions. And finally, the characteristics and circumstances of gun violence can really vary from one jurisdiction to another, and even from one neighborhood to another in the same city. So creating a complete picture of gun violence and the local situation and context in which it occurs will help determine the most effective responses. So with that, let me turn this over to my colleague, Scott Decker.
I have control of the slides, but they're not moving. There we go. One of the things that we know is that in responding to firearm violence, suppression is a primary tactic. That's a tactic that involves prosecution, it involves law enforcement, and more recently, it involves the use of advanced data collection, management, and analysis systems. Under prosecution, one of our suppression tactics that's been used, and to some effectiveness, are vertical prosecutions, where rather than cases being passed off in a prosecutor's office, they're handled by one team until the case is finally resolved, hopefully at sentencing. We've learned a number of things from Project Safe Neighborhoods, links to which are on the CNA SPI website if you want to follow those and maybe follow up at a later date. One of the things that came out of that intervention was gun case review, in which local police, prosecutors, DEA, perhaps FBI, probation, parole, where appropriate, meet weekly to review gun cases, whether they're seizures or possessions or shooting cases, try and look for trends and patterns, individuals who show up a lot in the review, and more effectively allocate cases to jurisdictions and kinds of prosecutions. Police obviously play the primary role in responding to firearm violence. That can take a variety of forms, whether it's increased surveillance or directed patrol through the use of things like intelligence-led policing or gun-focused policing, which is policing directly targeted at increasing the number of guns that can be seized from felons who are illegally in possession, or gang members, for example, who are at high risk for gun carrying and gun use. A number of violent offender programs have been developed, and in some cities, for example, St. Louis developed what it calls the WOW list, the worst of the worst offenders. Such lists are most effective when they're validated and verified with current information, when they're small enough that it's an actionable group. So 40 or 50 is a good number. 2,000 isn't quite as helpful. And then in addition, supporting all of these prosecution and police efforts would be advanced data analysis. We also know that one of the things that makes suppression more effective is if other groups are involved and if there are partnerships. One of the challenges is to sustain activities and interventions for partnerships, whether they're with probation and parole, whether they're with pretrial, juvenile court, community groups, advocacy groups, schools can enhance law enforcement efforts. We also know that acting strategically to better define, identify, and go after crime problems with a laser rather than with a blunt-edged instrument work more effectively, guiding these interventions with intelligence and analysis. And by intelligence, we mean multiple sources. The ATF trace data are quite useful investigative tactics, but when ATF can work with a gang unit in a local police department, their effectiveness can be enhanced. When we find a strategy, however old and true it might be, that isn't effective any longer, changing that strategy up is important. Offenders catch on to what we're doing all too often, and if we can change strategies up and do new things or different things, we can catch them off guard. Leadership is a key to any successful intervention. Finding the right leader for that intervention is quite important, as well as being accountable. When we've seen partnerships work and be effective, they most often have a high level of accountability, such that people come to every meeting prepared with data and information and intelligence, and they're able to put that information to use, and they're accountable to their partners. I did mention the WOW issue, the worst of the worst, and I want to highlight that because it's one of the concrete things that's been done and shown to be effective in removing high-rate gun offenders from the street with a targeted intervention. So a small group of targeted offenders that's nominated by prosecution, and that list is prosecutors and police. That list has been validated with criminal histories that check involvement in gun violence. And so there's a double level of intel that's used. There's data, number of times arrested, number of times suspected involved in a shooting, for example. But there's also the useful information that's provided by officers who work the street and know who the individuals are that are involved in shootings, who may not show up in arrest statistics. Some cities have found that individuals who were suspected but not charged with aggravated batteries or assault with a firearm or a homicide can make good targets. Law enforcement that works vertically, that involves partnerships at a variety of levels, local, state, and federal, can be quite effective. Some cities have found that such partnerships were effective in knocking homicide rates down, certainly in the short term, and coordinating across functions, whether it's police, probation, parole, prosecution, and jurisdiction, federal, state, and local, is also important. These issues are too important to let individuals slip through the cracks, and that's why we need other partners. The Gun Club is a group that is involved in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Missouri. They met weekly to review every gun arrest and included a variety of important individuals. Local police are listed last, but in terms of importance, they're probably at the top. And this was the first time in a very high-rate city of gun violence, St. Louis, where local police met regularly with ATF agents and were using the ATF trace data to make local cases, and it also allowed both state-level district attorneys, or circuit attorneys as they're called in St. Louis, and AUSAs to work together and decide who was going to take a particular case. The discussion of those cases often led to the involvement of other groups, sometimes probation or parole, and a variety of other interventions that allowed police and prosecutors to work together to get more out of their interventions and their efforts than they were getting in the past. A lot of these interventions are data-driven. The best ones tend to be. Certainly, we bring a number of assumptions to the table when we begin an intervention about what our problem is, that it's basically our violence problem. We either assume or have reason to believe it's all because of drugs, and if we go after drugs, our violence issues will decline. Many cities have tried that approach and found that it was more than drugs. and that they needed to go after the gangs, or they needed to go after long-standing turf battles. We have a saying that one data source is never enough. You may not need all 16 that are listed on this slide on the one hand, but if you have a research partner or if you have good crime analysts in your local police or your local prosecutor's office, they will tell you that multiple data sources are the best way to understand a problem. It's something that researchers call triangulation, which means putting 3 or 4 or 5 pieces of data together. Obviously, the UCRs and supplemental homicide reports have to be part of it, but record management system, CAD data are also useful. Some cities have looked at their shots fired calls from their CAD or their 911 systems, and the concentration of those calls is different than the concentration of gun violence in many neighborhoods. And that led police to look at different kinds of interventions for those neighborhoods. Some cities have found homicide incident reviews to be effective, really an anatomy, if you will, of a homicide that's led by typically a local detective, a local police homicide detective who may have investigated the case, but there's information brought in from schools and probation and parole and the gang unit prosecutors that allows a full assessment of what led up to this fatal killing and where were the steps that we might have been able to intervene earlier. Certainly the gun crime analysis of those data is important. Gun recovery data from local gun seizure database and the ATF can be very helpful with that. But I think it's useful to think beyond the typical suspects, if you will, that get involved in reviews of homicides, and think about ambulance data, think about emergency room data. ER trauma nurses know a lot about gunshot victims, their friends and their families from their interactions with them. Oakland, San Francisco, Atlanta have interventions now that try and use emergency rooms as a catchment area, if you will, for victims and sometimes perpetrators of violence. Some cities have done focus groups with offenders to learn more about where they get their gun, what their concerns are, and these can all be supplemented. If we know where abandoned buildings are, if we know where empty lots are, that can often be useful. And with the advances in the use of mapping and perhaps even drones in some jurisdictions, better understanding of land utilization patterns, and if you have ShotSpotter in your community, you know that it can provide useful data as well. I mentioned interviewing offenders a minute ago, and these are some simple graphs of juveniles and adults as they came into custody, as they were arrested on for crimes that would have been a felony. And the question that was asked, the juveniles are the lighter blue and the adults are the darker, the darker blue. And they were asked, when you leave the house to go out on the street, are you more afraid of the penalties, in other words, what you could get in terms of time for being in possession of a gun illegally, or running into somebody on the street who's got a gun? And we see that juveniles were a little more afraid of the penalties than armed guys on the street. Now, a number of adults couldn't make up their mind. They didn't know. But slightly more adult arrestees were more afraid of running into a bad guy who's got a gun on the street than they were the penalties that they would face if they were caught and convicted. And I know cities that have done this, look at that, say one of their challenges is if gun offenders aren't afraid of our penalties, of course they're going to continue to carry. So we have to do a better job publicizing, if you will, and some have hired, some municipalities have hired public relations firms to help them get the message across. It's certainly a key element of Project Safe Neighborhoods. Now, this is a slide that violates all the rules for putting slides together in presentations. There's too much information, but let me break it down to its I think most elemental form. What we're trying to do here is provide some sense of the effectiveness of getting illegal guns off the street and their costs. So we see at the top row, the horizontal row, search warrants, we know, are high level of risk for a variety of the people that are getting involved. We know that search warrants end up getting a gun a lot of the time, but they also bring some costs to them. They also reinforce some negative and often untrue stereotypes of what the police do and how they do it and where they do it. And then we look down the list in terms of going from search warrants to gun turn-in campaigns. We know that there's not much risk for the people who bring their guns in or the people who run the gun turn-in campaigns. They certainly get a large number of guns. Their impact on crime, though, has been found to be quite low. The guns that are turned in often are worth less than what cities are paying to retrieve those guns off the street, and they're unlikely to end up as crime guns. So this is a series of strategies and a variety of factors to think about as we intervene one strategy or the other. I want to close with a couple of summary observations, and I think the first one's really important. It can't be the case that the police are out doing an intervention and look around and they're the only ones involved. We need more partners. We need partnerships from city agencies, whether it means code enforcement or traffic, changing the direction of a street, whether it's the emergency and trauma groups that get involved. And again, ER trauma nurses and surgeons know a lot about gun violence and the individuals involved and their families. Neighborhood groups, whether your U.S. attorney has an anti-crime march on a monthly basis, if you look around and all that's out there is people from the U.S. Attorney's Office and nobody from the community, you're likely not to have much effect. And where you still have weed and seed operating, that's another good way to involve community. There's no single secret that if we just do this, gun violence will go down. It's a complex problem. It requires solutions that recognize the complexity of that problem. Certainly going after illegal gun sources is a good idea, but it's difficult and complicated, and we need to learn from local success. There are some cities where a very small number of officers are responsible for taking a large proportion of illegal weapons off the street. Interviewing them to find out what they do and how they do it is useful in terms of broadening our impact. Clearly, the leaders play an important role. We need strategic leaders at the top. We need action leaders who make things happen on the street. That will generate buy-in from a variety of groups. We also know that there's other ideas that are out there. Some cities have gun courts. Some cities work through their juvenile court, or they do visits and interviews with families of people who've been shot in the emergency room. We need to tighten up emergency room notifications that there have been gunshot wound victims. and there are jurisdictions that have been successful. You know, one of the hardest things I think to do is to change a homicide unit within a police department, and yet Boston, when they saw their clearance rate drop down into the 40s, their chief said, we're going to shake up the homicide unit, we're going to do things differently. It met with resistance, but over time, the unit changed, and now their clearance rate's gone up nearly 18% since the change. They now work much more closely with detectives early in the case, and that's one of the SPI interventions that you can read about on the SPI website. So it's my pleasure now to turn things over to Deputy Chief Dennis Kato, who's going to talk about Operation Laser in the Los Angeles Police Department. And Chief Kato, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks, Dr. Decker. Let me see, as soon as I get control here. Oh, I already have control. Good afternoon, everybody, and I want to thank CNA and SPI for allowing me to showcase what we're kind of doing here in Los Angeles to really decrease the incidences of gun violence. Everything Dr. Decker spoke about is what we found to work here in Los Angeles. And what we did was, over the past 8 years, is really refine a system in Los Angeles to really look at gun violence and create strategies to attack it. And what we call the process here in Los Angeles is Operation Laser. So let me begin. What we know in the past 8 years is this is what's worked in Los Angeles in the reduction of gun violence, is really using data to really deploy our officers. And that means using analytics and the data to put cops in the right place at the right time. And we do that using several models. So we call it predictive policing, or many call it predictive. I call it forecasting. We use PredPol for our property crimes, and then we developed Operation Laser to really go after our violent gun crime using data. And it really was taking the officer's intuition and experience, which is what we normally would use to deploy our officers, and really kind of back that up using data to support or refute some of the ideas that they had as far as putting officers in the right place. And then using that in addition to removing of impact players, and I think Dr. Decker spoke about that very distinctly, that one city used WOW. We call it chronic offenders here in Los Angeles. And it's really using data to identify those few who are the trigger pullers and the people that are responsible for the crime in a certain area. And the several tools we use to do that is we use Palantir has created a program that takes our very diverse, we have about 13 different data systems here in Los Angeles, but they put that tool all together so that detectives and the investigators and my crime analysts can go to one place and actually draw data from all those various sources and compile a very, very efficient list of people that have been identified to be responsible for crime, have a criminal history, that has gun violence in their history, and how many contacts they have made. But using that to identify those players has been very impactful here in Los Angeles. And that's really a core piece of Operation Laser, as you'll see as I get better into this program. And then really, we wanted to also use data to get to a place where our captains were able to see what's coming at them. So really take a look at history, what happened the year before that. Take a look at their gun violence patterns and really have try to identify trends and patterns, so as they're going into a 4th of July weekend, for instance, they can better deploy or get more officers out in the street, use their specialized units, and kind of do some enforcement efforts prior to that spike in violence to try to abate that before it occurs. And we've seen that that's been very, very successful here in Los Angeles. I put dashboard up here. Palantir helped us create a dashboard for my commanding officers of our areas that really shows them trends for the past 2 years in crime. They have a mapping capability in that, and they can see dosage based on GPS data, where their officers are spending their time and whether that reflects where their crime is occurring. and they can make adjustments and create missions using that dashboard. And then we have what we call a strategic planning group that has really kind of laid the foundation for where Los Angeles or the LAPD is going to go in the next 3, 4, 5 years from now. And all of that together has led to an incremental crime reduction or sustained crime reduction here in the city of Los Angeles. So let me get into how laser developed. So since the 90s and going into the early 2000s, we were experiencing a steady decline in crime in Los Angeles. And many of the leaders here started questioning how low can we actually get, and will we get to a point where we hit what we would call friction, where we've taken all the low-hanging fruit, we've taken the big gang members off the street, and do we get to a point where it's going to get harder and harder for our officers to effectively reduce crime? And so they started looking at different tools and developing an idea or strategy as far as how do we police them when we get to that friction point. And so in 2009, from a BJA grant, we partnered with Dr. Craig Uchida from JCC as a research partner, and we implemented or developed what's called LASER in Newton Division. And it was Newton Division, for those who aren't familiar with Los Angeles, was called Shooting Newton. They averaged about 45 homicides in 2007, 2008, and before that they were always somewhere around in the 40s as far as homicides. Once we put laser into effect and started using this model, we saw a significant decrease in the homicides in 2011, which you can see 56%, and a 59% decrease in 2010. Actually, in numbers, that equates to, they hit their lowest level in 2010, and they had 12 homicides. Newton Division since 2009 has never gone over 20 again in the number of homicides, and it's attributed to Operation Laser and the tools that we use. Let me explain where the name laser came from. At the onset of this development, many of us in the leadership of LAPD went through the 92 riots, and we knew that just a straight suppression type, a saturation type policing effort may lower crime, but at the same time it alienated the community, and we ended up with a 92 riot. So in developing a new strategy, we knew it had to be a lot more focused, and it had to include the community, and it had to really support and build trust in the community that the police were not randomly just going out and stopping everybody in the community, but was really focused on those trigger pullers and those that were the most violent. So in March of 2016, so let me go back. In Newton, we started in 2009, and we left laser in just that one division. And so from 2009 to 2016, laser was only being tested in Newton Division. And as I mentioned earlier, they kept their homicides under that 20 rate. And so everyone in the city kind of paid attention to what Newton was doing and what Operation Laser was doing, but it really didn't become a model for the entire department until 2016. And in March of 2016, we actually saw violent crime starting to increase significantly throughout the city. And I believe that was experienced nationwide. This was the same year that Chicago hit the 700 number in their homicides. So in March of 2016, Chief Beck told us we had to do something to abate this process so that we wouldn't have a 2016 that was crazy. So when we took a look at our data, we identified that 4 of our divisions, there's 21 divisions in the city of LA, so 77th, Southeast, Southwest, and Newton, those 4 divisions accounted for 48% of the city's violent gun crimes. And that's a significant number. And so we said, let's focus using laser, what was happening in Newton, and really focus it on these 4 divisions and see if we can make a dent in the violent gun crime for that year. You'll see that once we implemented the laser techniques or began using CSOC and laser, you can see this dramatic slide that occurred in the homicide. So the dotted line is where we did the intervention when CSOC was created. You can see we were at a 54.5% increase in the homicide rate from the year before. And by August, we had actually reduced that to actually a negative 10% compared to 2015 in the homicide rate. This same slide would also be seen if I put up victim shot. We were measuring number of victims shot in those areas, and you would see the same type of decrease that you see here in the homicide rate. So we knew it worked. We knew laser was something that had to be used in the rest of the city of Los Angeles. So from 2016, we began implementing it citywide. Here's the elements of laser that we know work. Form a crime intelligence detail, pairing up an analyst with an officer. And where that partnership becomes very valuable is that the officer adds credibility and insight based on what he knows of the area. So we suggest that it should be somebody very knowledgeable about crime. Credibility is so that he can go to roll calls and really get the officers to really take in what the analysts are seeing and accept the data for what it is and really trust the missions that we put them on for that day. We identify, laser really works on identifying hotspot corridors, and what that is based on is 10 years worth of violent gun crime data. We will identify areas within the division, corridors, which are very small street segments that show this is the area, if you concentrate on for the 10 years, this is where your gun crimes have been significantly high. And we maintain them for 9 to 12 months so that we can do a really good study and really determine the effectiveness of whether our efforts in that box has really made the difference or not. We then take that data on a daily basis and we create missions which direct our patrol, bike, and foot units into that hotspot, and we ask them to find not just to patrol it and put time in the box, but really use their experience to identify what is it that's drawing crime there. Why is that certain segment of your division the hotspot? And you'll see later that that's where I get the buy-in from the officers. When I tell them to go in there and use their experience to really identify what's happening, I get a lot more traction from the officers and a lot more buy-in as far as using or putting them in that, because many of them will push back and say, I don't want a computer telling me where I need to police. Also, part of laser, like Dr. Decker had mentioned, was identifying what we would call chronic offenders, and those we have probably about 50 per area, but we tell them to concentrate on the top 12. We create what we call chronic offender bulletins, which are not arrest bulletins, but just a alert to tell officers that this person has been one of your most violent offenders in the area. We do what's called, many cities would call custom notifications. We actually go and speak to the offender, go to his house, offer him services. But we also maintain a system where we track how many contacts we have with this offender, how many times he's been arrested. If he does get arrested, when is his next release date, and where is he going to be released to? And we use the number 12 because that's easier to manage. And then as people get arrested, we'll take people off of the list of 50 and continue to keep 12 on a monitoring basis. We also identify anchor points, and these are areas or locations within the laser zone that is drawing crime. It could be something like a problem liquor store where the gang members are hanging out. It could be a gang house. But what we use then is all the other city tools and the attorney's office, city attorney's office, to really abate the location or gain compliance by those property owners to really fix that problem and really disrupt where the gangs can actually hang out, which then takes the targets off the street. And we've found that that has worked immensely successfully here in Los Angeles. And then what we do is collect and look at our data and make tweaks to it on a daily basis. So Operation CSOC uses this daily cycle to look at crime. And we do this 5 days a week. At its height in the summer, this will go to a 7-day-a-week conference call. And it entails all of the commanding officers of those 4 areas. It includes their 2 deputy chiefs that they report to, and it includes probation, parole, and any other specialized entity that we have here in Los Angeles that's involved in reducing violence in that area or may be deployed in these areas. So how this cycle works is at the very beginning of the day, my data analyst, the crime intel detail, will gather crime info for the 24-hour period before. They will analyze that and take a look at also collect the data that came from the suppression units and their missions and their recap, and overlay that with the data and see whether or not their actual deployment affected the crime, or did I continue to still have crime while they were deployed there. Once that analysis is done, we do a conference call where all the players get together and we decide and collaborate on where we should be putting our resources for the following 24-hour period. And I think this is where Dr. Decker made a good point. This is when we gain information from other source points. So many of our captains would have already talked to, we have street interventionists here in Los Angeles. So many of them would have already spoken, our captains would have spoken to those interventionists and they would, on this conference call, tell us what those interventionists are telling them about what the recent shooting was about, who's feuding with who. Probation and parole gets involved and will tell us who their parolee or probationers are that are in the areas of these shootings. And based on this pool of information, we will then identify what we want to be the mission for the next 24-hour period. And this is where we build a team of teams type concept, because everybody starts being very, very collaborative in the sharing of information, sharing of resources, and then the chiefs buy off on the actual missions, and that's disseminated back out to the units right after that conference call. And then those units will go out and deploy, and over their period of that day, they will do the job of what we're asking for in the mission, and I'll show you a mission sheet later. And then we just start the cycle over again the following night. We will collect what they had actually done as far as arrests, tickets, citations, deployment, dosage. We'll analyze that again with the 24 hours worth of crime, and we start that cycle over again. This has been very, very successful in keeping us focused in the areas as our commanding officers get busy with other things. So we want to bring them back to crime at least an hour every day. This is just an example of what our chronic offender bulletin will look like. These are the 12 for one division here in the city of Los Angeles. But this would also, what we found happened with this bulletin is help maturize my officers quicker. So many of our officers have probably less than 2 years out in patrol. And so for them to really identify and learn these players will probably take them about a good 3, 4, 5 years in a division. But what we found is when we started giving them this list and they started seeing these people walking around in their neighborhoods, they had a better learning rate. They were quick to adapt and learn that these are the people that they have to pay attention to, and not necessarily what we told them was to just stop them every time you saw them, but to monitor their presence. If you could constitutionally make a stop, do that, but just be aware that he's there and just monitors what he's doing. If he's near a shooting, if you see him walking away from a recent robbery call, that's somebody you probably should pay attention to. When we did this, what we also found was that we started gaining more trust in the community, because no longer were the officers just stopping everybody in the street, but they were stopping these players that the community really knew were the problem people in their location. So we actually enjoyed a better trust factor with the community when we started going to these chronic offenders. I'm going to give you another example of what we also pass out based on those crime conference calls. This is just a normal hot sheet that everybody probably uses throughout law enforcement. Normally, though, you will see that it's based on stolen cars. What we found here was these are vehicles that we don't have much information on, but we do know that they were involved in robberies involving guns. And so what we asked our motor officers, who are basically traffic enforcement tool here, is when you're out and about doing your traffic enforcement, is to concentrate on these types of vehicles. And if you could make a stop on these vehicles, what I needed was information on who was driving it, license plates, that type of information, because as I could feed our system, then our investigators had a better chance of solving that crime based on the information we were bringing in based on these hot sheets. What we found interesting is once we started doing this, the rate of citations actually increased on their own because the officers thought that they were using their abilities more effectively, and they were actually affecting crime. So we saw that benefit in that. This is just an example of one of the maps we use in our 24-hour crime conference calls. Those with the narratives are those crimes that happen in the 24-hour period. Those that you see grayed out, these little symbols on the map, are those crimes that occurred in that same week, but happened on probably 48 hours, 72 hours before. But the benefit of that is as the week goes through, as you get closer to the weekend, the captains and commanding officers can actually see patterns emerge and can actually adjust their deployments based on those emerging trends. These black corridors you see are our actual laser corridors where we focus on the chronic offenders and anchor points. When we did all of this, what we found interesting in Los Angeles is that these are the number of guns that were recovered in those 4 divisions. And you'll see the first column are those guns that were recovered in the 3 months before CSOC was implemented. And then the middle column is those guns that were seized after CSOC was implemented. And it is a 4-month count as opposed to the first 3. So there is an additional 28 day period included, but you'll see a dramatic increase in the number of guns that were taken once we started focusing officer efforts into the right areas and on the right people. The only place that did not change was in Newton, and I would attribute that to the fact that Newton was already in laser, and so really they were already doing that type of policing, so we didn't expect to see any change there. And lastly, this is what one of the divisions looked like as far as the hotspots in 2016. You can see those blue boxes on the left are our laser zones, and they're smack dab on top of the hotspots for gun violence. And you'll see at the end of 2016 that, especially in this bottom right box, you'll see that the dissipation of that heat signature and that we effectively reduced the gun violence in that corridor. And in all those laser zone boxes, you can see a decrease in the density of that color, but also in the number of gun violence. So we knew that it was effective in 2016. Many thought, okay, that's just 1 year and it's a one-off, and maybe it's not going to be that successful. But I'm going to show you this slide, which shows that in 2017, in those same 4 divisions, we continue to see a decrease in the number of homicides, the number of victim shots, and the number of shots fired. And as we go into 2018, we are continuing to see that slide downwards in those 4 divisions. So we know laser works. We know laser has been very effective, and now it's being implemented in 16 of our 21 divisions, and we should have the entire city on laser by the end of this year. And that is the end of my presentation for Los Angeles, and I'm going to turn this over to my friend, Deputy Chief Jonathan Lewin from CPD. So hold on, Jonathan. Let me see if I can get you over here.
Thank you, Dennis.
You're welcome.
So unlike Scott Decker, all of my slides violate the PowerPoint rule, so I just apologize in advance. I'm going to pretend you're all laughing. I can't hear you because you're muted, but I will pretend that you are. Okay, I heard one. So this is kind of why we did this. Chicago's homicides, as Dennis I think kind of mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, 2016 was a bad year for us. It was on one of the earlier slides, I think. You know, there was recognition in the department that something had to change. So the superintendent and the mayor essentially charged us with trying to develop some kind of an intervention solution to address this problem. So partnering with actually Sean Malinowski at LAPD and the University of Chicago Crime Lab and some other people that have been helping. And Dennis has actually been out here a number of times. We've been to LA. We came up with a project that we're going to talk about briefly here called the Strategic Decision Support Center, SDSC project. Just some background on Chicago very quickly. It is the second largest police department in the U.S., 3 police areas, 280 beats, 22 police districts. We have about 12,500 sworn now. We will be onboarding, we'll have a net increase of about 1,000 officers. So we will, to do that, we actually have to hire 2,400 to keep up with attrition. So there's a lot of growth in the department that's happening right now from a personnel perspective, certainly. We've always had a lot of technology here, but it's been kind of stovepipe. There have been a lot of separate systems that people have had to go to extract data. It wasn't very consumable. It was not very actionable sometimes because of kind of the stovepiped nature of some of these sources. So everything from, we had ShotSpotter in 2 small areas of the city, about 3 square miles total. But that was on a separate platform. You had to go to ShotSpotter's website to see the alerts. Surveillance cameras, but they were not integrated with ShotSpotter. A mapping platform that really wasn't integrated with cameras, and a range of other data sources like CAD and incidents and arrests and others that were all kind of separate. So the goal here was to create a physical space. It's an actual room. That's a diagram of the kind of a drawing of what the room looks like, where we could enhance the technology and, more importantly, enhance the process. And you'll see that some of this is kind of similar to what Dennis just talked about, because it's some of it's patterned on what LA was and is doing with laser and related processes. But the room becomes very important, having a physical place where collaboration can occur. It's staffed 24/7. We actually got into a discussion about what the staffing actually has to look like and who actually has to be there. There is a civilian criminal intelligence analyst for the first time, believe it or not, Prior to this project, Chicago never had them. So we've hired some that are city staff, and the University of Chicago Crime Lab has also provided some through a contract with them. But the goal here is that every one of these rooms, and there's one in each district that has the intervention, has a crime analyst assigned to it. They don't work 24/7, but the room is staffed 24/7. So we had a ton of information. We had a ton of different systems, but it was hard for people to get insights out of those systems. So this process, the SDSC process, combines better technology with an enhanced process. The technology is we put smartphones out, 75 additional phones per district, not enough for every single officer to have one assigned, but enough for every working officer to check one out while they're working. Predictive policing, we're using a tool called HunchLab. LA is using PredPol. We're using HunchLab. It's just another place-based prediction tool. There's others. ShotSpotter and additional cameras. So we already had a lot of cameras in Chicago, the largest camera network in the country, but we added even more cameras in these SDSC districts. We looked at, essentially we looked at geographies that did not have a camera within 300 feet of multiple shooting incidents. So it's basically what street segments had multiple shootings in a year but did not have a camera nearby, and that's one of the ways that we determined where to put some additional cameras. This is HunchLab. If you're not familiar with it, it uses things like incidents, arrests, weather, calls for service. It's now ingesting ShotSpot data, and it comes up with areas of risk where we deploy additional resources and concentrate intervention activities. This was mentioned earlier about having other entities besides the police department engage in problem solving. We are going to be starting that. We have another grant through BJA called TIPS grant, that will allow us to create a collaboration platform that will share information with authorized recipients to the level of authorization that they're allowed. So for example, and I've just had this conversation with our Department of Finance, they operate some boot vans that have license plate recognition, so they're looking for cars that are boot eligible. We also are going to be pushing our hot list of wanted vehicles, stolen vehicles, out to those vans. So if they get an alert, we'll be notified, and we'll also get their license plate read data. But for this purpose, they will help us by concentrating some of their boot scanning activities in these areas of risk. So this will help drive not just the police department, which it's doing today, but other city services and eventually other public and private entities to help concentrate at least place-based interventions in some of these areas. They change 3 times a day. It's an automated process. Cameras we talked about. So we had a ton of cameras. They weren't integrated into things like the ShotSpotter network until this project, so we've done that. And we're using Genetec, which always was our video management system, but we asked Genetec to integrate things like ShotSpotter, calls for service, incidents, arrests. We have AVL, GPS on all the police vehicles and also the fire vehicles. That all comes together. Gang boundaries, you all know Chicago has a pretty entrenched criminal street gang issue. So those gang boundaries are integrated into these maps, into the platform, along with recent arrests and a range of other information all in one place, highly consumable. So the goal here was to provide real-time situational awareness, integrating the people and process and technology into something that we think is more useful. Those are some of the data sources that I just talked about. ShotSpotter you're all familiar with, so I won't spend a ton of time on it. You know, none of these things is the answer by itself, and actually that's an analysis challenge that I'll touch on briefly in a minute. But ShotSpotter provides faster detection time, more accurate location information, and we think a more complete picture of every shots fired event, because not every time there's a shots fired event does somebody call 911. This slide probably looks familiar because it's kind of based on what Dennis showed a little bit earlier. But this is the intelligence cycle, and this happens in the SDSC rooms. So it's a continuous assessment of incoming information using the data sources I talked about that helps inform deployment decisions. There's the collaboration process, outside entities, our state's attorney, the U.S. attorney in some districts, detectives, you know, other internal divisions, bureaus all come together and participate in this daily intelligence and briefing cycle, which informs the commander who makes the final decision. And in the center of that circle that's a beehive. It took me about 8 months to figure out what that is, but that's what it is. So beehive of activity. So that's kind of the process. There's a community component too that's getting off the ground a little bit more effectively now. We're rolling this out actually in one more district tomorrow, and the community will be involved. They'll come in and do some tours. But using that collaboration platform that I talked about with the TIPS grant, that'll be one way that the community can participate in the process. So they'll be able to credential themselves through this secure portal. They can be anonymous, of course, if they want to be, but information that we can exchange with the community on problems and on ways the community can help engage with us to solve them will be kind of managed and facilitated through the portal, which will almost be like a problem management platform. And when you think about, not to get too far into the weeds on it, but when you think about how we map things right now, we're mostly mapping incidents, right? We're mapping arrests, we're mapping calls for service, but we don't map larger problems. This will be a way that we can describe and define and map problems and then engage resources to help us solve them. So here's some results. I don't know why I got, and this is a little bit outdated, but this was looking at 2017 versus 2016. We were down 22% in shootings in citywide, but in the tier ones, and it's a little hard to read that, we're down 26%. So the point here is that the districts, the tier ones are the first 6 districts to go live with SDSCs. We'll be in 13 districts by the end of, actually by summer of this year. But the point here is that the districts that used to drive up the violence in Chicago are now helping to drive it down. Those 6 tier 1 districts, and they're 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 15, with 7 and 11 being the first 2 to go live last year. Those districts together are down 26% in shootings. All districts are down 22%. If you take the tier 1s out of the citywide reduction, the city's down 16%. I just ran the stats yesterday to update them. So right now, citywide 2018 versus 2017, citywide is down 28% in shootings, 18 to 17, and we're down 27% compared to 16. The tier 1s are down 33%. If you take the tier 1s out of the citywide is down 23%. And you see similar kinds of stats when you look at homicides. Here's comparing the tiers. Again, this was 17 versus 16 entire year. The tier 1s, if you look at the top left, down 26%. Tier 2s down 14%. Tier 3 down 23%, and so on. So what you see there is that the tier 1 used to be the most violent districts. I mean, there's still violence there, obviously, but they are decreasing more than any of the other tiers in the city, which is pretty stunning. And here it is just represented in a graph. There's the tier 1s, SDSCs in red, with 7 and 11 in blue. Same kind of what I just talked about with the numbers. This is shooting incidents. Here's just a summary of what I just talked about, so I'll skip it. Here is just another way to kind of look at the same information, but looking at trends. So looking at the 90-day period after go live versus the 90-day period prior to go live, and then looking at what the effective change, the difference between the 90 days pre to the prior year versus the 90 days post to the prior year. You see that there's even reductions in almost all of them when you look at a trend analysis. So it's almost, no matter how you look at it, we think there's a significant impact. I'll skip that. Here's just another pre and post, but this is just looking at, not looking at the prior year, but just looking at the maximum number of days prior to go live versus equal number of days post go live. They're down 25%. So no matter how we looked at it a variety of different ways. 200 days pre versus 200 days post in the prior year. And then this is University of Chicago helped us put together a synthetic control. So the original plan was we were just going to go live in 2 districts for all of 2017 and kind of evaluate and have 2 experiment districts and then have 2 comparable control districts. Once we started seeing some early results, the superintendent wanted to expand more quickly than we had originally planned, so we ended up doing 4 more districts, and of course now we're doing more districts this year. But what made it that created a challenge because we didn't have a real way to evaluate. So the University of Chicago created a synthetic control, and it's described there, basically to create a district that was most like the 7th district and see how the performance would have been without the intervention using that synthetic control. And when you look at that, so here the black line represents shootings in the actual 7th district, the real 7th district. The red line is the control. So in other words, what shootings would have looked like in the 7th district without the intervention, without the SDSC. And then that gray area is, that shaded area is when the SDSC went live. So you can see what would have been expected without the SDSC versus what actually happened with that black line in that grayed out area. So February to November of 2017, 107 fewer shootings, which University of Chicago says is significant. There was not a significant change in total arrests, and the reason they looked at this is that we wanted to show that just simply increasing the arrests was not what was driving down the violence. So we think, and some of this was in some of Scott's presentation, you know, we think it's precision policing, smarter policing, being in the right places at the right times, focusing on the right people. We think that's what made a difference. Leadership, morale, the University of Chicago did some qualitative assessments for us and measured things like morale. And we think that the officers are, the morale is potentially better in the SDSC districts. They see an investment in technology and process. Just building out the rooms, we think, was really important because the officers saw that something different was happening. We also prioritize some additional resources to those districts, so we're upgrading the vehicle fleet, for example. We started the upgrades, the replacement of old cars in the SDSC districts. The officers saw that. We did some simple things like in roll call rooms, when we could, we repainted the rooms if they needed them. We put some new furniture in. So we wanted the officers to see that we were addressing some issues that they had brought up in focus groups that were important to them. So gun arrests also, this is also looking at the 7th district, again using that same kind of comparison. Well, this is actually comparing to non-SDSC districts, but also looking at synthetic control. Gun arrests are up. And again, we think that smarter policing played a role here. The last thing that I'll talk about in the 3 minutes left is this is one thing that I think HunchLab helped us do, and I've gotten into this discussion with some other departments and some other researchers that we can debate how predictive HunchLab actually is or isn't, but even if it's not predictive at all, if we're changing up these intervention zones 3 times a day and we're tracking where people are going and what they're doing when they're there and how much dosage is being provided in the zones, even if they're the wrong zones, I think that mobility is increased. So we look at how often the cars and what amount of the geography in the district the cars are covering when they're on the street. And in the SDSC districts, post-implementation, there's more mobility. So the cars are covering more geography. And here, this is interesting. It's a little hard to see it. The University of Chicago helped us put this together. But this is looking at patrol coverage pre and post. So the patrol patterns on the left, again, it's a little tough to see it. We're concentrating around the district station, which is on 63rd Street on that corridor. So the highest concentration of patrol was actually around the station and on 63rd Street. But in 2017, post-implementation with HunchLab and all the precise intelligence and the daily intelligence cycle helping to drive field decisions, there's a shift of more high-intensity patrol in areas where the violence was. So we think that that's an additional outcome. This is just showing some improvements in shots fired response times in the SDSC districts, the first 2 to go live with ShotSpotter. So again, I think ShotSpotter is helping to play a role here in improving response times. Not that this is the answer, but it's a benefit certainly. Here's the mobility I talked about. Here's 3 of the SDSCs, 7, 11, and 15. Had among the highest miles driven per district than the non-SDSC districts. They were at in the top 3, actually. This is just our expansion timeline. So we're in Again, we're in 6 districts now. Actually, we went live in 3, 4, 5, and 25, so 4 additional districts. The rooms went live in December, so we're up to 10. And then the next 3 to go live will be 2nd, 8th, and 12th districts. So when we're all done, we will be in 13 police districts. Just went through some areas of further research here. Unfortunately, I have to sign off the call, but my email is up at the top. If anyone has any questions, be happy to address them. Thank you.
All right, Chief, thank you very much. I want to thank SPI and CNA for letting Syracuse be a part of today's presentation. We're excited to share with you today what we've been doing with our new offender-focused policing strategy. Today's the first day since, I want to say, September of 2017 that it's actually reached 50 degrees in Syracuse. So I promise to keep it within my time frame here and be out of here within 5 to 10 minutes. So thank you again for allowing us to present today. I won't, in the interest of time, go over all of these numbers as far as our crime rates. You can see based on our population and the violent crime rate and the murder rate that although we're a small city, we do have big city crime. And what seems to be a theme, based on what I heard from Los Angeles and Chicago, 2016 also marked one of our worst gun violence years in over a decade. I am happy to say that 2017 was better, and we hope that the strategies, or one of the strategies we're going to share with you today is making a difference in that happening. What we know, based on most jurisdictions affected by gun violence, that is largely driven by gangs. In the city of Syracuse, 63% of our south side shootings between the years of 14 and 16 were gang-related. And like most jurisdictions, we know that a small percentage are actually gang members within the city, and even smaller percentage are prone to picking up a gun. That being said, one of the steadfast strategies that we've had here in Syracuse is our focused deterrence strategy. We followed the GVI model probably to a T here. We've had call-ins. Recently, we switched to custom notification letters and custom notification visits. We have a robust infrastructure for services for individuals in gangs and that are a part of the violence to take advantage of, strong outreach with state-funded SNUG, and we have a good community involvement. So that being said, what we wanted to do with our offender-focused policing is take what we learned in our GVI model, or focused deterrence, and adapt and apply that to our worst of the worst. We've heard that a couple of times now, our WOW, our chronic offenders. Take that deterrent strategy and deal with the gun violence by dealing with our chronic offenders. I will say that we've had a core list in the past of up to 60 people, and I would really suggest, as you've heard on this call, to keep that manageable. Right now, we're running about 25 to 30, and that seems to work for us. So I would really suggest keeping a small chronic offender list when you're trying to deal with the offenders and focus on them. I'll kind of skip over this slide. You've all heard that the basis of this type of policing is founded based on publishings that you've heard about here and likewise. So what we do is we take the enforcement part of the lever pulling out of focused deterrence, and we apply that to our core members. And we handle, just like we would a trigger, if you're familiar with the GVI model, we handle our core offenders in the same way, and we bring every available resource or every lever we pull against those individuals. Borrowing further from our focused deterrence model, we also have a personalized visit or custom notification with each one of the core offenders. Good procedural justice type message, warning them ahead of time what their continued involvement in gun violence will bring under our new strategy. One thing to mention is that we have a strong working relationship with the John Finn Institute. We've had that for over a decade now. I really strongly suggest, if you're not working with a research partner, to do so. A lot of what we're able to do, we're doing because of what we have with the Finn Institute. And we have a local crime analysis center that we work with regularly as well. We also conduct quarterly intelligence sessions where we bring in officers. You've heard that on this call. We hear what they have to say, probation officers, parole officers. We also build social network analysis, which I may or may not have heard on this call, but basically you get that, that spider diagram that shows ties between your offenders, let you know who those impact players are, where the cut points are, and who to select as your core offender or your chronic offender. So every 2 weeks we meet with our partners, local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, the DA's office, probation, parole, and we hold what we call PERP-STAT meetings. And we actually review each offender and assign each offender out to an agency, and we tailor the enforcement based on that offender's profile and where maybe they're subject to enforcement. This is what one of the offender-focused sheets looks like, and we track a whole host of information. We've added things as we went along because they were important and things that officers or detectives were looking for. On the right-hand side are things that we do to include GPS, probation home visits. Surveillance is big. The offender, sometimes they know you're watching them, and that's good too, because what we're trying to do is deter gun violence. If we arrest them, that's great, but also the surveillance and even letting them know that we're out there is helpful as well. We also have a process and outcome evaluation that we are going to conduct. We're tracking the core offenders that we're working on now with the same core offenders from last year, and also the core offenders that didn't quite make the list. So we want to see how we're doing with tracking. All right, so we want to see if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in the PERP-STAT meetings, as far as the enforcements and the contacts. So we look at that in our process and outcome. We also, if I can get the slide to work here, we take a look at how the whole program is being implemented. And I think this is really important to have a research partner looking at this. They can come in and say where maybe certain agencies are doing really well, where certain agencies need to pick it up. And I think that's an important key element for the process and outcome, is to see how you're doing, what kind of job you're affecting. And then finally, obviously, the big factor is where you're reducing gun violence. And having done this strategy for just about 8 months now, we don't have that post-intervention period where we can give you any numbers on that. We're confident that based on our increases in the way we are contacting the core offenders, that will have that effect, but at this moment, we don't have those numbers. I will say that based on the first 6 months of implementation, our number of stops on our core offenders almost doubled over those 2 control groups that I mentioned. The probation home visits and contacts and violations also went up, and our indictments and not so much convictions, because convictions take some time to get to come forth, but definitely indictments have gone up. So our contacts and arrests and stops have gone up. We're hoping that equates into reductions in gun violence. So with that being said, I will turn this back over to our webinar hosts.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all the previous presenters. Now, I know you've heard a lot of information on gun violence strategies, so we wanted to quickly sum up and provide the key themes from today's webinar before we go, and also to some questions that you've been asking throughout the last hour and a half. So, in terms of the key themes from today, first, collect and assess data initially and throughout your initiative. Work with research partners if possible. Second, develop partnerships and promote teamwork with key stakeholders, agencies, and community members. Third, identify interventions that have evidence they work and fit your context in your jurisdiction. These strategies are the ones that are most likely to be effective. Fourth, be accountable. Provide feedback and data to stakeholders and community members that you're working with. Remember that those are the folks that you serve. And finally, simply reacting to gun violence is not enough. To be successful, strategies should be based on prevention. So being strategic and preventing the problem from occurring in the first place is really key. So with that, let's entertain some questions from those folks that have been with us for the last hour. Emma, I think you've been getting some questions over the chat function. Could you read some of those, and we'll ask our presenters to answer?
Absolutely. Our first question or suggested idea was in regards to Dr. Decker's presentation, which was perhaps there ought to be collaboration on warrants, at least with partner law enforcement agencies as well as social services.
Emma, would you repeat the question?
Sure. So the comment was perhaps there should be collaboration on warrants, at least with partner law enforcement agencies as well as social services.
Yeah, it may be the hardest, but also the most important part of putting together a good strategy. One of the things I like most about the approach that BJA continues to take about addressing crime problems is their emphasis on the need for collaboration and partnership. That said, they can be difficult to start if they don't exist. There has to be a pretty high level of trust and accountability among partners in the room, but cities that have made it work have seen long-standing results, and the goal is, you know, not to put the police out of business, because that's not going to happen, but the goal is to reduce these levels of crime that just seem to spike from time to time in large cities, so that the police can engage in other order maintenance functions. So they're hard, they're critical, they're important, and there are certain individuals that are more adept at initiating and sustaining a partnership than others, and it's important that they be tapped to do those jobs.
Thank you, Dr. Decker. We also had a few questions from Deputy Chief Kato's presentation. The first was, what about the role of forensic DNA information to help identify perpetrators and connect them to guns used in violence?
Yeah, thanks. In those conference calls, when we're evaluating that 24-hour cycle, those are the kind of questions that come up in that conference call. Whenever we see robberies involving guns, whenever we see, we actually delve into some of the individual cases. I think some would call that we're diving into the weeds. But I think initially when we started those conference calls, we needed to get those commanders and people on the calls into that mindset. And so we do press on the need to, did they take DNA swabs at the crime scenes? We also fast-tracked for those 4 divisions. They had priority, what we would call priority, they had what we call Walking Wednesdays, or their evidence would take priority over everything else in the city, so that would get returns faster. And that was not just on DNA, but that's also including fingerprints.
Thank you. Another question we had was, one study showed that decreases in violent crime levels were a matter of offenders moving to new locations. So can you speak to the violent crime declines you saw in relation to that?
You know, that's an interesting one, because that's a discussion that I always have with Dr. Uchida. As any city, you'll always see some, not displacement, but you'll see communities change as far as population, types of communities that are, or ethnicities that are moving into a community. So in those 4 divisions, there was a change in the demographics. So let me go back to, for instance, 177. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was probably 90% African American. And if you look at that community now, I'd say there's about 60% Central Americans now and about 40% African American. So was there a change? Yes, there was. But what we saw was those changes had occurred early in late 90s and early 2000s. So even during this intervention period, we didn't see a change in the demographics of those 4 divisions from 2010 to 2018. We might see that in other parts of Los Angeles, but in those 4 divisions, we didn't see that change or migration of a community to that we could say effectively changed the crime patterns.
Thank you, Deputy Chief.
That makes sense.
The last question we had was asking Chief Lewin to comment more on ShotSpotter. I think he had to leave the webinar, but do any of our presenters can comment if they wish more on ShotSpotter and its role.
Yeah, this is Chief Kato. As Chief Lewin mentioned, I've been over to Chicago a number of times. We've been working in very good partnership. You know, we don't have ShotSpotter here in Los Angeles. Chicago's effectively been using ShotSpotter, and this is just from my viewpoint or our discussions with Chief Lewin. So what ShotSpotter gives you the ability to do is actually what the manufacturer will tell you is that they're going to give you more gun calls or identify more incidences of where gunshots are occurring based on the notion that a community is not calling for the majority or for you're missing a number of these calls for services when a community doesn't call you for a gunfire type incident. We don't believe that was happening in Chicago. What it did help in Chicago though was when you pair ShotSpotter up with the robust camera system that Chicago had, was that immediately upon getting that ShotSpotter alert, that SDSC room and their officers in the street get their alerts on the phone. So response time was cut down pretty dramatically in responses to gunfire incidents, but they also had the ability to go right to the cameras in the neighboring intersections right around where the gunfire was caught or heard, and that was using those cameras in conjunction with ShotSpotter was very effective, and I believe is why they're seeing such great success in Chicago right now, and that's something we're trying to evaluate here in Los Angeles, whether it'll work here without the camera system. But that's what I know of the system, but we attribute a lot of the success in Chicago to, one, the ability for the officers to get that alert right on their phone so it increases that response time, but two, also the pairing with the cameras was able to give them the ability to identify the offenders as they left the location, if that answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chief. We have received a few questions about if these slides will be available after the webinar. They will be posted on the SPI website very soon, so you can access them there. At this time, we don't have any more questions, so I'll turn it back over to Chris to close out the webinar.
All the speakers' participation, as well as the questions that we received from our audience. We hope we gave you a better idea of some strategies that have proven to be effective in reducing gun violence and give you some insights into ways you might be able to apply it, some of those strategies in your own communities. After this webinar is over, you should be receiving an evaluation on both the content as well as the delivery of today's webinar. We hope you'll give it some thought and give us some good feedback. One area that we do appreciate as we're looking to future webinars is our topic areas that we could possibly cover through this series. We have a number of sites doing a number of innovative strategies that are being rigorously evaluated through the SPI, and we'd love to get ideas on which ones you think would be most interesting to our audience members to attend. So with that, again, thank you all, and have a good afternoon.